Racist cops arrest black woman. Stunned when she's the judge presiding over their case. Samantha Turner, a respected attorney in the bustling city of Denver, rarely had time to relax. Between court cases, client meetings, and the never-ending piles of paperwork, peace was a luxury she had long since given up. But that afternoon, as she walked through the peaceful Fort Collins Park, she felt the rare, fleeting joy of solitude. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the world felt perfectly in balance. Samantha found a quiet spot on a bench by the pond, settling into her usual rhythm. Her book was in hand, a hardback novel that had been on her reading list for weeks. She was determined to escape into its pages, just for a while. However, the serenity of the park was abruptly interrupted. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement shattered the stillness. Samantha looked up, confused, as a police cruiser pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their expressions immediately locking onto her. "Excuse me, ma'am," one officer called, his voice hard. "Could we speak with you for a moment?" Samantha, ever calm, raised an eyebrow but nodded, closing her book and placing it gently on the bench beside her. "Of course," she said coolly, not yet understanding what was happening. The officers approached, their eyes scanning her as if she was somehow out of place in the peaceful park. One officer asked, his tone suspicious, "We received a call about suspicious activity in this area. What exactly are you doing here?" Samantha's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading," she replied, holding up the book as if to prove her point. The second officer, more insistent, asked for her ID, and the questions began to feel more like an interrogation than a routine check. Samantha, though confused, complied, but a knot tightened in her stomach. She felt the familiar pang of something wrong, something that felt like an injustice about to unfold. With every question, she felt more and more like an outsider in her own city. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone, waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting on his belt in a way that felt threatening. Samantha kept her composure, but beneath the calm exterior, her pulse quickened. She had handled many tense situations in the courtroom, but this was something different. This felt personal. She was used to navigating power dynamics, but this one was strange. "I don't see how that's any of your business," Samantha said firmly. "I'm not answering any more questions until you tell me why I'm being detained." This was the tipping point. The officers, now visibly annoyed, moved in closer, and one reached for her arm. "Don't get smart with us," the first officer growled. "You're resisting arrest." Samantha's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just sitting here." The officer's grip tightened as he snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. As the crowd that had gathered murmured in confusion, one woman pulled out her phone to document the scene. Samantha's heart raced, the surreal reality of the situation sinking in. The moment was being captured. But it wasn't enough to change what was happening. The police cruiser ride to the station felt suffocating. Samantha, a woman who had spent years defending clients in court, now found herself on the other side of the justice system. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Inside the station, the humiliating booking process stripped her of any last shred of dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and thrown into a holding cell. Hours passed, and Samantha replayed the events of the afternoon in her mind over and over, trying to make sense of it all. How had it come to this? The charges against her were flimsy, resisting arrest and obstructing an officer, but she knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. Even after being released on bail, Samantha's resolve was unshaken. If she had learned anything over the years, It was that the system needed to be held accountable. And she wasn't about to let this injustice slide. With each passing day, the fire within her grew stronger. She knew the road ahead would be long. But Samantha had one thing that no one could take from her, the knowledge that she could and would fight back. The early morning sunlight barely made its way through the blinds of Samantha's apartment, casting faint shadows across the papers scattered on her desk. The air was thick with tension. But this time it wasn't because of a case she was working on for a client, it was her own case. And it was personal. It had only been 2 days since her arrest. But already the reality of what had happened was settling in like a weight pressing against her chest. The handcuffs, the humiliation, the way the officers had treated her as if she were a criminal. Despite having done nothing wrong, Samantha ran her hands through her hair, trying to shake the fatigue. She hadn't slept much. Her mind wouldn't allow it. Instead, she spent the night going over everything: the interrogation, the walk to the cruiser, the look on the officers' faces as they had taken her away. She had never been on the other side of the law before. And now she found herself fighting for her rights. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. Samantha looked up, blinking away the haze of exhaustion. Her colleague and close friend, Marissa, stepped inside, carrying a bag of takeout and a look of concern on her face. "How are you holding up?" Marissa asked softly, placing the food on the kitchen counter. Samantha managed a small smile. "I'll be fine. Just trying to get things together," she replied, though her words didn't carry the usual confidence. Marissa glanced at the papers scattered around the room: court documents, evidence logs, and a thick folder labeled "Case Strategy." "You're already diving into this full force." "Huh?" Samantha didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and ran her fingers over the top of the file. "I have to. I'm not going to let this slide. It's bigger than just what happened in the park. This is about every time someone has been unjustly treated by people who are supposed to protect them." Marissa nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know, Sam. But you need to pace yourself. You've got a fight ahead of you." Samantha's eyes hardened. "I've been fighting my whole life. This is no different." Days turned into weeks. And as Samantha dove deeper into the case, she started to realize just how much was at stake. It wasn't just her reputation on the line, it was everything she had worked for. Her years of defending people who had been wronged, of standing up against systemic injustice, had prepared her for this. But this battle would be different. The officers who had arrested her were part of the very system she had spent her career trying to hold accountable. They were supposed to serve and protect. Yet they had done the exact opposite. The weeks following her release on bail were marked by a whirlwind of activity. Samantha pored over case law, reaching out to colleagues who had experience with police misconduct cases. She knew that this was going to be a long, drawn-out battle, but she also knew that every move had to be calculated. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. One night, after hours of research, Samantha sat back in her chair, her eyes bloodshot and tired. She looked at the clock, 2:45 a.m. A yawn escaped her lips, but she quickly suppressed it. The case was too important. She had just started drafting the civil rights lawsuit when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed, "Marissa." "Hey," Samantha answered, still trying to shake off the fog of exhaustion. "Samantha, you need to see this." Marissa's voice was urgent. "The video of your arrest has gone viral." Samantha's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, viral?" Marissa sighed. "It's everywhere. Social media, news outlets, people are outraged. They're asking why this is happening. People are rallying behind you." Samantha felt a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and a flicker of hope. I had no idea. Well, now the whole world does. And they want answers. Marissa continued. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Sam. You are fighting for everyone who's ever been treated like this. You've become a symbol. Samantha let out a long breath. I didn't ask for this. But I can't back down now. Marissa's voice softened. You're not alone in this, Sam. We'll fight this together. The next day, the media frenzy was unlike anything Samantha had ever experienced. News outlets were calling. Reporters were lining up outside her office. And the video of her arrest was playing on repeat across every platform. The footage of Samantha, calm yet defiant, as the officers dragged her away was now an emblem of resistance. Samantha's law firm, at first, had been hesitant to support her. They were concerned about the publicity, worried it might overshadow their reputation. But Samantha had made it clear that this wasn't about her, it was about what was right. She couldn't back down. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. At a press conference, Samantha stood at the podium, her face composed but her voice unwavering. What happened to me could happen to anyone. This is not just a personal matter. It's about the systemic issues that allow abuse of power to thrive. It's about standing up to a system that, for too long, has turned a blind eye to injustice. I will not allow that to happen anymore. Her words resonated with people all across the city. And soon, she was flooded with messages of support. People who had experienced similar mistreatment, people who felt powerless in the face of authority, began reaching out. They thanked her for standing up. They shared their stories of injustice. And Samantha realized that this wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of every person who had ever felt powerless, overlooked, or unheard. But as the public support for Samantha grew, so did the pressure. She knew that she couldn't afford to make a misstep. Every decision, every legal strategy, had to be flawless. The stakes were higher than ever. And the road ahead was fraught with challenges. One afternoon, as Samantha reviewed her case strategy, Marissa called again, her voice tinged with disbelief. You're not going to believe this, Sam, but you've been assigned as the judge for one of the officer's misconduct hearings next month. Samantha froze. What? Marissa repeated herself slowly, letting the weight of the news sink in. It's the irony of it all. You've spent weeks preparing to sue these officers. And now you're going to sit on the other side of the bench. You'll be presiding over their case. Samantha's heart raced. She had fought for justice her entire career. But now, the universe seemed to be throwing a curveball. Would she be able to remain impartial? Could she bring herself to judge the very officers who had wronged her? As she stared at the phone in her hand, Samantha realized that this was no longer just a case. It was destiny. It was a chance for her to truly change the system, to show what justice really looked like. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Samantha spent long hours preparing, reading through the case files, reviewing the details, and strategizing how best to approach this. She knew that she had to be calm, controlled, and unbiased, even though her personal feelings were anything but. The morning of the hearing arrived, and as she entered the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another case. This was her chance to prove that justice could prevail, even when the system itself was flawed. She stepped into the judge's chair, her robes flowing behind her. As she scanned the room, her eyes locked with the defendants, Officers Carter and Daniels. The realization hit them like a freight train. The woman they had arrested, the one they had humiliated, was now the judge. And with that, the true battle for justice had begun. The day of the hearing arrived with a weight that felt almost tangible. Samantha Turner sat behind the judge's bench, her robes draped around her, the gavel resting within easy reach, waiting to strike. The courtroom was quiet, eerily so. The usual murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished wood floor. All of it was absent. It was as if the room itself knew what was about to unfold. Samantha adjusted her posture, her fingers brushing lightly over the gavel. She felt the eyes of the room on her, those of the two officers, Carter and Daniels, seated at the defendant's table. They were stiff, their uniforms as pressed as their expressions. But there was no hiding the tension in their faces. She could see it in their eyes, the realization that the woman they had arrested just weeks ago was now sitting in judgment over them. The room was packed. News outlets had caught wind of the irony of the situation, and reporters filled the back rows, notebooks in hand, phones poised to capture every moment. The gallery was teeming with spectators. Some were there out of curiosity, others to show their support for Samantha. But no matter their reason, one thing was clear: the stakes were higher than ever. Samantha took a deep breath, glancing at the officers one last time before clearing her throat and bringing the room to order. The air felt thick, but she fought to keep her voice steady, projecting authority over the tension that hung in the room. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity. "Please be seated." The officers seemed to shrink under her gaze as they sat back down. Their body language betrayed them, stiff, uncomfortable, a far cry from the self-assured figures they had been the last time she had seen them. Samantha shifted her focus to the prosecution, who was preparing to present their case. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Peter Hartley, was known for his no-nonsense approach and quick wit. As he stood to address the court, he glanced at Samantha, his eyes briefly flickering with understanding. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him either. "Your Honor," Hartley began, "the case we are about to present is one of excessive force and abuse of power. We have evidence that will show that officers Carter and Daniels acted without justification, treating an innocent woman with disregard for the law and common decency." Samantha's gaze remained fixed on the officers as Hartley laid out his argument. As he spoke, her mind wandered back to that day in the park. The image of Carter reaching for her arm, the cold snap of the handcuffs locking around her wrists, the way Daniels had stood by, silent and complicit, the humiliation she had felt, not just as a woman but as someone who had spent her entire career fighting for justice, flooded back with vivid clarity. Her jaw clenched, but she remained composed. She had to. This wasn't about her, it was about something much bigger. We will show that the actions taken by the defendants were not only uncalled for, but that they represent a larger, systemic issue within this department. Hartley continued, his words sharp and decisive. This is not an isolated incident. The evidence will prove that the officers acted with deliberate malice, without any cause to stop or question the defendant. Samantha's thoughts refocused. It was time. She couldn't let her personal feelings cloud her judgment, no matter how much she wished it could. The case wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent. She was going to make sure that the truth was heard, loud and clear. As the prosecution presented their evidence, a video played on the large screen in the courtroom. The footage from the park, recorded by a young woman who had witnessed the entire incident, was now front and center. The grainy footage showed Samantha sitting peacefully on the bench, the officers approaching her, their questioning growing more aggressive. The tension in the video was palpable as one officer reached for her arm, and the other demanded her ID. Samantha could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her as the video continued. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. while others nodded in agreement. It was clear from the footage that the officers had overstepped their bounds. But Samantha knew the defense wouldn't go down without a fight. As the video ended, Hartley turned to face the defendants. "Your Honor, the evidence is irrefutable. The officers abused their power, and they must be held accountable for their actions." The defense attorney, a man named William Grant, was quick to stand. He was known for his sharp tongue and his ability to twist facts to suit his narrative. His suit was perfectly tailored, and his confidence radiated from him like a shield. He approached the bench with a calm demeanor, but Samantha could tell that beneath the surface, he was rattled. "Your Honor," Grant began, "what we've seen here is a one-sided interpretation of events. Yes, the video shows the officers interacting with Ms. Turner, but it fails to capture the context, the full scope of the situation. The officers were merely responding to a call about suspicious activity. There was no ill intent. They were doing their jobs." Samantha's eyes narrowed. She had heard these kinds of justifications before. The same tired excuses, the same deflection of responsibility. But this time, the stakes were different. She wasn't just sitting back, observing from the sidelines. She was the one in control now. "I'd like to remind the defense that we are not here to debate the officer's intent," she said, her voice firm. "We are here to determine whether their actions were justified under the law. The evidence will speak for itself." Grant's lips tightened, but he didn't back down. "We will show, Your Honor, that the actions of the officers were necessary for the safety and security of the public. They were simply acting within their discretion to ensure that no crime was being committed." Samantha raised an eyebrow. She knew what was coming. The defense was going to play the safety card, something that many officers used to justify their use of force, even when it was unwarranted. But Samantha wasn't buying it. Not this time. The defense continued their argument. But Samantha's focus shifted. As the attorneys spoke, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that was looming over her. She was the one who would ultimately decide the fate of these officers. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the message that would be sent. She could either let this moment pass or make it something that would change everything. The day wore on. The tension in the courtroom building with each passing minute. Witnesses were called, and testimony was given. The story of what had happened in the park was unfolding, piece by piece, but each piece felt like a battle. By the end of the day, both sides had presented their cases. Samantha's mind was buzzing with the weight of the evidence. She had heard enough to make her decision. But now it was time to reflect. Could she truly be impartial in this case? Could she look at these officers and not let her personal experience influence her ruling? As the court adjourned for the day, Samantha remained seated, her hands folded in front of her. The room emptied, but she stayed behind. She had a decision to make, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. The courtroom was a tense, charged atmosphere as the trial entered its final day. Samantha Turner sat at the judge's bench, her hands folded in front of her. But inside, her mind was a whirlwind. The prosecution had presented a solid case. The defense had done everything it could to spin the narrative in their favor. Now, it was up to her to decide. She had already reviewed the testimony, the evidence, and the emotional weight of the case. The video from the park, showing her peaceful afternoon turned into chaos, was a haunting reminder of the injustice she had faced. She thought of the officers' faces as they stood in the courtroom, their self-assured demeanor faltering as the weight of the evidence bore down on them. They were used to control, to power, but in that moment, they were just like anyone else, accountable for their actions. Samantha's gaze flickered toward Officers Carter and Daniels. seated at the defendant's table. They were no longer as confident as they had been when the trial began. The cocky, arrogant air had been replaced with unease and uncertainty. She could see it in their eyes. They were scared. And they should be. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Marissa late last night, where the weight of the situation had felt almost unbearable. "You can do this, Sam. You know what's right. Trust your instincts," Marissa had said. Samantha had clung to those words. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about retribution. It was about justice. She had always believed in justice, no matter where it came from. And right now, it was her turn to uphold it. As the final witness finished their testimony, Samantha stood, adjusting the robes that seemed heavier than usual today. She could feel the pressure of every eye in the room, the spectators, the media, the officers, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't back down, not when so many people were depending on her to get it right. Closing statements. Samantha called out, her voice firm but tinged with a quiet exhaustion. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of the case or the toll of the past few weeks, but every moment felt like it could be the tipping point. Peter Hartley, the prosecutor, stood first, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Your Honor, the evidence in this case speaks for itself. What we have here is a clear violation of the rights of an innocent citizen." Officers Carter and Daniels did not have probable cause to detain Ms. Turner, let alone to escalate the situation to the point of arrest. The video shows the disproportionate nature of their actions. There is no defense for what they did. They abused their power. Plain and simple. Hartley paused, his gaze never leaving the defendants. The system is only as strong as the integrity of those who enforce it. If we allow these officers to walk free, we are sending a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. It is not. We cannot allow this to stand. We must hold them accountable for their actions. Samantha felt a surge of pride as she listened to Hartley. His words were measured, precise, and they resonated deeply with her own sense of justice. She glanced at the officers, their expressions stiff but strained. They were trying to hold on to whatever confidence they had left. But it was clear that they knew what was coming. Then, William Grant, the defense attorney, took the floor. His voice was cool, calculated, but there was an edge of desperation now that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution's case is based on nothing more than a selectively edited video. It's an incomplete picture, an oversimplified portrayal of what happened that day. The officers were simply responding to a call about suspicious activity. They acted within their training, within the scope of their duties." Grant paused, looking directly at Samantha as he continued. "This trial isn't just about what happened between Ms. Turner and these officers. This is about questioning the authority of law enforcement. If we are to make decisions based on a single perspective, a single moment captured in time, we risk undermining the very system that ensures our safety. These officers did nothing more than their jobs." Samantha didn't flinch as Grant spoke. She had heard these arguments before. Too many times. From too many people who tried to justify their actions in the name of safety. But there was something else she had learned over the years, the difference between following procedure and abusing power. Grant's argument had one glaring flaw. He was ignoring the fundamental principle that police officers, like everyone else, were accountable for their actions. Samantha closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow, steady breath. The gavel in her hand felt like an anchor, its weight a reminder of what she was about to do. She had heard enough. It was time to make a decision. "Thank you," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The court will now deliberate." The hours that followed were some of the longest Samantha had ever endured. The room was silent as she sat at her desk, reviewing every detail of the case once more. The video, the testimonies, the arguments. She even found herself replaying the moments in the park, when she had been caught off guard, when she had felt so helpless. But she couldn't afford to be emotionally compromised. This wasn't about her, it never had been. It was about holding the officers accountable for their actions. It was about standing up for the people who didn't have the privilege to do so. As she reflected on the case, Samantha thought about her own journey, the struggles she had faced as a woman of color in a field dominated by men, the challenges she had overcome, and the battles she had fought. She wasn't just fighting for herself now, she was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unjustly by the system. Every person who had ever been silenced. She looked down at the case files one last time before making her decision. There was no more doubt. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. The kind of tension that could be felt in every corner of the room. Samantha entered the courtroom, her black robe flowing behind her, and every eye turned toward her. The officers sat at the defense table, their faces pale, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Samantha took her seat behind the bench, her eyes scanning the room, the reporters, the spectators, and then finally, the officers. There was no hesitation in her voice as she stood. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony presented, Samantha began, her words steady. I find that officers Carter and Daniels violated the rights of Ms. Turner. There was no justification for their actions, no reasonable cause for their detainment, and no excuse for the excessive force used during her arrest. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. The actions taken by these officers were a direct violation of the public trust. They abused their power, and for that, they must be held accountable. Samantha's gaze moved over the officers. Carter and Daniel seemed to shrink in their seats as the finality of her words hit them. Therefore, Samantha continued, her voice unwavering. I am ruling that both officers Carter and Daniels are to be suspended without pay for 6 months. Required to attend retraining on de-escalation techniques. And their actions will be permanently recorded in their disciplinary records. This court will not tolerate the abuse of power. And I will ensure that such actions are held to the highest standards of accountability. The room erupted in murmurs. But Samantha raised her hand, silencing the crowd. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and in that moment, Samantha knew that the battle was far from over. But she had done what needed to be done. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was justice. The gavel echoed through the courtroom, and the sound reverberated in Samantha's chest like a drumbeat. Each strike a mark of finality. The case was closed. The officers had been held accountable for their actions. Yet as she sat at the bench, staring at the empty courtroom, she knew that this victory was only the beginning of something much larger. Samantha had done what was necessary, but the weight of it all still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had delivered a verdict. But she wasn't just a judge in that moment, she was a symbol. The path she had walked from that day in the park to the courtroom today had transformed her. Not just as a legal professional, but as a person who had fought for justice in a way she never had before. The officers, once so certain of their power, had left the courtroom under a cloud of defeat. Their faces were pale, their steps slow as they excited. The silence in their wake spoke volumes. Samantha felt a flicker of triumph. But it wasn't about them. It was about the people watching. The ones whose voices had gone unheard for so long. It was about the message that had been sent. No one is above the law, not even those meant to enforce it. As the courtroom cleared, Samantha remained seated at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She could hear the faint murmurs from the hallway, reporters, members of the press, their voices rising with excitement. They were eager to capture the moment, to tell the story of the woman who had made history. But she wasn't interested in the spotlight. Not today. "Hey, Sam." A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Samantha turned to see Marissa walking toward her, a look of relief and admiration in her eyes. Her friend, her ally, had been with her every step of the way, through the late nights. The doubts, the fears, she had kept her grounded. "You did it," Marissa said, her voice low but full of pride. Samantha managed a small, tired smile. "We did it. We all did." Marissa's smile widened, but there was something else in her eyes, something more than just happiness. "This is bigger than you realize. You know." Samantha's expression softened. She knew what Marissa meant. The trial had become something of a catalyst. It was no longer just about her, or even about the officers. It was about a larger movement, a shift in the way people thought about justice, about police accountability, about the power structures that governed their lives. "Yeah," Samantha said, looking toward the door as reporters filed in. "I think it is." Over the next few weeks, the case continued to make headlines. News outlets and social media platforms buzzed with conversations about the verdict. But as the dust began to settle, Samantha turned her focus back to the people who needed it most, the ones who had inspired her to fight in the first place. Her law firm had supported her decision, and though they had initially feared the publicity, they quickly realized that this case had not just been a personal battle. It had become a defining moment for the firm, a symbol of standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. Samantha was invited to speak at community events, town halls, and even universities, where students and activists alike sought her insight on how to create real change. She became a voice for the voiceless, a leader who not only fought for justice in the courtroom but also for systemic reform. And as she listened to the stories of others who had been mistreated, abused, and overlooked, she knew that the fight was far from over. One afternoon, as she left a local community center after a meeting with activists, a woman approached her. Samantha hadn't seen her before, but there was something in the woman's eyes that struck a chord. She was older, in her 60s, with graying hair and hands that trembled slightly as she reached out to Samantha. "Excuse me, Ms. Turner?" the woman asked, her voice thick with emotion. Samantha turned, giving her a warm but curious smile. "Yes, how can I help you?" The woman took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the words. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did, for standing up for all of us. I've been scared for so long, afraid to speak out, but watching you fight, it gave me hope. You made me believe that we can actually make a difference." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had heard messages of support, countless texts, calls, and emails, but there was something different about this woman's words. They weren't just a thank you. They were a reminder that, despite all the barriers, despite the system stacked against them, change was possible. Samantha smiled gently, taking the woman's hand in hers. "I'm just one person, but together, we can create change. You don't have to be afraid. The only way we move forward is by standing together." The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for showing us that we have a voice." As the woman walked away, Samantha stood there for a moment, watching her go. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had fought so hard, why it was worth it. This wasn't just about legal victories. This was about creating a legacy of hope and accountability. This was about giving people their dignity back. In the days that followed, Samantha found herself in a new phase of her life, one that balanced the pressure of the courtroom with the passion of activism. The case had sparked a conversation. And now, it was time to keep it going. Samantha's case was the catalyst for larger reform discussions. It wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It was about a system that had been broken for far too long. Communities across the country began to demand change, real, substantive reform to law enforcement practices, to ensure that what happened to Samantha would never happen again. But there was still much work to be done. And Samantha knew that. She wasn't naive to think that one case could change everything. The fight for justice wasn't over. But now, there were more voices, more people standing alongside her, more people ready to take the next step. As she sat in her office one evening, staring out the window at the city skyline, Samantha allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The journey had been long. The obstacles had been many. But for the first time in years, she felt like she had made a real difference. And that, she realized, was worth every second of the fight. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but it was changing. And Samantha Turner, the woman who had fought against the very system that had tried to break her, was at the heart of that change. The fight was far from over. But Samantha was no longer just a voice in the crowd. She was the voice of accountability, the voice of justice, and the voice that would carry on long after the trial was over. For her, this wasn't just the end of one case. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And Samantha was ready to keep fighting for what was right. As we reach the end of Samantha Turner's journey, it's hard not to reflect on the deeper lessons we can take from her story, lessons that go beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, and resonate with our everyday lives. This isn't just a tale of one woman fighting against the system. It's a story about all of us and the power we have to create change. Stand up for what's right, and hold ourselves accountable, no matter the odds. Now, let's take a moment to pause, breathe, and think about what this story truly teaches us. First and foremost, justice is not always easy to attain, but it's something worth fighting for. Justice isn't about quick wins or easy solutions, it's about resilience and determination. Just like Samantha, we may face challenges, setbacks, and even moments of doubt. But in the end, the pursuit of what's right will always prevail if we're willing to keep pushing forward. Second, accountability is the cornerstone of a fair society. Whether it's a police officer, a government official, or even ourselves, no one should be above accountability. Samantha's story reminds us that when power is abused, it's up to us, individually and collectively, to call it out and demand that those responsible face the consequences. It's a powerful message, one that encourages all of us to speak out when we see something wrong, and to never stay silent in the face of injustice. Lastly, resilience is a quality we all need in our lives. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when the world seems stacked against us. But just like Samantha, we have the power to rise above adversity. It's not about avoiding difficulties, but about how we respond to them. The strength to rise again after each fall, to learn from our experiences, and to keep fighting for what's right. That's what shapes us into the people we aspire to be. So, as we wrap up this story, think about the lessons it offers. Whether you are facing a personal challenge or dealing with a bigger issue, remember that justice, accountability, and resilience are always within your reach. Don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. Even when it's difficult, be the person who makes the world a better place. Not by waiting for others to act, but by leading the way. After all, It's our choices that define us. Just as it was Samantha's choices that led to her victory. And that's a lesson worth remembering in our own lives. Every single day.